In the streets of America, there are men that have risen to dominate the streets, with crime and drugs being the thing that made their name bring fear to people. In all walks, these men have gone down in history for being well-feared and well-connected, and have caused crime and crack coke to influence an entire generation negatively. Today, we will look at the most dangerous street legends. Number 11. Eugene Big U. Big U was a longtime leader of a Los Angeles street gang who investigators say ran a mafia-like criminal enterprise that included homicide, human trafficking, and extortion, while he also worked as an entertainment entrepreneur. Eugene Henley Jr., known as Big U, was one of 18 members of the Rollin' 60s neighborhood Crips charged in a federal complaint with a litany of federal crimes, including dope trafficking, conspiracy, and firearms offenses, at his latest arrest this year. Henley allegedly masterminded a criminal operation that investigators dubbed the Big U Enterprise, and is also suspected of embezzling donations to Developing Options, an anti-gang charity he founded, but which prosecutors say he used as a front for fraudulent purposes and to insulate its members from suspicion by law enforcement. He is suspected in the 2021 executing of an aspiring rap musician who was signed to his recording company, Unique Music, according to prosecutors. The rapper, identified in court documents as R.W., was allegedly shot and slaughtered by Henley after he recorded a defamatory song about the gang leader at a Las Vegas studio, prosecutors said. R.W.'s body was found in a ditch off Interstate 15 in the Nevada desert. Prosecutors said Henley ran the enterprise like a mob boss and used his stature and long-standing association with the Rollin' 60s and other street gangs to intimidate businesses and individuals in Los Angeles. Not only did the enterprise expand its power through violence, fear, and intimidation, but it also used social media platforms, documentaries, podcasts, interviews, and Henley's reputation and status as an OG to create fame for and stoke fear of the Big U Enterprise, its members, and its associates. Number 10. Richard White Boy Rick Wershey of Detroit, Michigan. Very rarely does a teenager attract the attention that White Boy Rick garnered during his heyday in the streets. He became a local pop culture touchstone as he rocketed to stardom in the vicious and brutal urban underworld of Detroit in the mid-1980s. Not only was he a teenager, but he was white, and these unlikely circumstances led him to the top of the black underworld at the age of 17. White Boy Rick came to dominate Detroit streets in the rough and rugged crack era, a time marked by massive bloodshed and death because of the burgeoning coke trade. By the age of 17, White Boy Rick was one of the most powerful kingpins in Detroit. Associating with a colorful cast of drug and gun thugs that held sway in the city, like Maserati Rick, the Chambers Brothers, Best Friends, and D. Holloway. At the age of 15, White Boy Rick was meeting with Detroit police and federal agents and getting paid for information. Yanked out of high school, he was groomed as a high-profile drug dealer and transformed into the notorious White Boy Rick. When the feds no longer needed him, they cut him loose and busted him for dope trafficking. He got in the game as an informant, turned into a legend, and is now serving life because of his notoriety in the Michigan state system. It's said that during his trial in 1988, he was rocking Armani suits and had throngs of teenagers packing the courtroom and chanting his name. He has gone down as an infamous street legend of epic proportions. Number 9. Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols of Queens, New York. As the south side of Jamaica, Queens became ground zero for hip-hop hustlers, the mythology and legend of Fat Cat has grown and taken on an Al Capone-type level. Fat Cat was the star of the Dope Show in the 80s. He had more money, more bling, more cars, and more power than all his contemporaries. He was the first and most successful of the crack-era gangsters. Numerous rappers like 50 Cent and Nays have dropped his name in verse. The south side of Jamaica, Queens, and more specifically, the block on 150th Street, was where Fat Cat held reign. The area brought in millions annually due to the drug trade, and Fat Cat pocketed most of these ill-gotten gains. In a time dominated by the Italian mafia, Fat Cat got his and set the stage for the rappers and the burgeoning hip-hop scene with his attitude, mentality, and style. Fat Cat was too big and too known. He made too much money and had too big a profile. He got busted and continued to run his empire from prison. He had his parole officer whacked for violating him and killed at will, trying to take out all the witnesses against him. He was eventually tied to the homicide of the New York police officer with Pappy Mason that shocked the nation and ushered in the current war on drugs. Fat Cat is serving a life sentence in the New York State prison system for multiple 25 to life charges despite cooperating with the feds in the Pappy Mason massacre case. Fat Cat and his supporters dispute this, but he was in the BOP WITSEC program for over 20 years before being shipped to the state to finish out his time. Number 8. Kenneth Boobie Williams, Miami, Florida. Boobie and his crew built an $80 million drug empire that smuggled over 5 tons of coke from Panama and the Bahamas. He was the namesake of the gang and the alleged mastermind behind the Carroll City organization that left a trail of bodies on Miami's streets. The rapper Rick Ross has chronicled Boobie's exploits in verse and continued to keep the legend alive. Miami police linked as many as 35 assassinations and 100 shootings to the Boobie Boys as they unleashed what the papers called an 8-year barrage of massacre and mayhem on the city in the 90s. A decade of death, the newspapers called it, as the savage drug gang killed to establish their turf and retaliate against rivals with AK-47 blasts. Warring with other drug factions in the Miami-Dade area, the Boobie Boys left death in their wake as AK-47s sprayed rapid fire, cutting down all in their path. By turning their neighborhoods into virtual narco zones and killing fields, the Boobie Boys hastened their own demise. Boobie and all his comrades are now serving life sentences in the BOP, mostly at USP Coleman in Florida. They are true street legends from the crack era in Miami, modern-day Tony Montana's. Number 7. Howard Pappy Mason of Queens, New York. In one of the most violent eras in New York City history, Pappy Mason rose above his peers to cement his reputation as one of the most feared men in the 5 boroughs. He was an enforcer for the premier drug dealer of the day, Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols, and leader of his own gang, the Bebos. Pappy was known as the crazy guy that crazy guys feared. He has been featured in FEDS magazine and profiled in Queen's Reign Supreme and the dope game misadventures of Fat Cat and Pappy Mason. Originally from the Jamaican Crown Heights area of Brooklyn, Pappy made his name in Queens when the South Jamaica crack wars were in full swing. He held down the block for Fat Cat and his crew and had his own spot in 40 projects where the Bebos held sway. When Pappy was in the streets, the dudes were shook and wouldn't dare to cross him. When Fat Cat got locked up on a violation by his parole officer, Pappy Mason killed the PO in retaliation. He eventually took it one step further and had a New York City police officer executed when he got locked up, sending out the chilling message from prison, "We lose one, they lose one." He was tried and convicted on all counts. Pappy Mason was a die-hard drug game soldier. When the crack vials spawned violence and bloodshed in the mid-'80s, he was the baddest man on the block, and his name has been lionized in verse by Jay-Z, Nas, and 50 Cent. Number 6. Kenneth Supreme McGriff of Queens, New York. Supreme is a towering street legend immortalized in both hip-hop and hood lore, an infamous drug lord with ties to both major players in the rap industry and a notoriously profitable and ruthless drug crew. To both law enforcement and a generation of rappers and hustlers, Supreme is a Black John Gotti. The Supreme team ruled the same Queens streets that later produced platinum-selling artists like Run DMC, Nas, Ja Rule, and 50 Cent. Supreme was one of the most notorious street figures out of Southeast Queens, and his name has transcended New York City due to the countless name drops of his crew, the Supreme team in hip-hop and popular culture. Downfall and made a film, Crime Partners, with the backing of Irv Gotti and his Murder Inc. record label. But the feds couldn't let Supreme live. They investigated him and Murder Inc. for years, eventually convicting Supreme on a bogus murder-for-hire case. His downfall was that he was a larger-than-life figure who couldn't outlive his past. Number 5. Freeway. Ricky Ross of Los Angeles, California. Known as the Godfather of Crack, Freeway Rick goes so rich so fast that he used to tell people that God put him on earth to sell cocaine. He's been called the Walmart of crack and was the biggest black drug dealer of recent history. He was a trailblazer in the crack trade and reaped millions as an unknowing pawn of the CIA, who used the millions he generated to fund the CIA-sponsored Contra War. Several rappers have taken Ross's name as their stage monikers to capitalize off his notoriety. At the birth of the crack epidemic in LA, Freeway Rick found himself at the helm of a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. By the mid-'80s, Ross was LA's godfather of crack. Jumping into the role of drug lord with a passion, he used his sharp mind to organize a criminal operation that franchised crack outlets across the nation, like McDonald's. He was arrested by the Freeway Ricky Ross Task Force and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. After winning his release due to police corruption, Ross sought his redemption, but fell victim to the drug game and got a life sentence. After almost 2 decades in prison, Ross got his case overturned and is now back in the real world, using his expertise to change lives and make his fortune. An epic and controversial figure, Freeway Ricky has single-handedly been blamed for the crack epidemic. He moved tons of coke, made millions of dollars, and supplied the Crips and Bloods with enough product to saturate and infect every inner-city neighborhood across the nation with crack. With drive-bys, gang proliferation, and the crack plague, his legacy Freeway. Rick has turned his life around and now is doing all he can to overturn his legacy as a drug dealer. Number 4. George "Boy George" Rivera of South Bronx, New York. Boy George was a multimillionaire by the age of 21. Barely out of his teens, he built himself a reputation as one of the wealthiest drug lords to come out of New York and the youngest to be charged with the Kingpin statute. The press called him the Puerto Rican James Bond due to his fleet of cars and all the gadgets he accessorized them with. His story has been profiled in Don Diva magazine, Street Legends, and Random Family. His Bronx, New York heroin operation grossed $250,000 a week. Boy George was the master of the Bronx universe. He carved out an empire and flooded the streets of Manhattan and the South Bronx with high-quality heroin with the brand name Obsession. He flaunted a lifestyle as lavish as a New York socialite, like those portrayed on Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. Flamboyant and charismatic, the Puerto Rican drug baron was one of a kind. His cars were straight out of a James Bond flick, and his illicit wealth attracted the wrong kind of attention from law enforcement, which led to his downfall to the tune of a life sentence in the feds. Equal parts gangster, CEO, and gentleman, Boy George juxtaposed street smarts, innovative marketing, and ruthless efficiency to create a heroin empire, while other kids his age were still worrying about what clothes to wear or what girls to date. As a teenager, Boy George had it all. Number 3. Rayful Edmond from Washington, D.C. At his peak, Rayful sold 2,000 kilos a week, reaped gross profits of $70 million a month, and ran an operation with over 150 soldiers to support him. In the high-profile and glamorous life he led, champagne flowed like water. Trips to Las Vegas, New York, and Los Angeles were commonplace, and $50,000 shopping sprees at Trump Plaza were the routine. 60 Minutes called him the $300 million man. To his hometown of Washington, D.C., during his 1980s reign as the city's biggest coke dealer, Rayful Edmond was public enemy number one. At the height of Dodge City's brutal crack epidemic, Rayful distributed 60% of the cocaine that flooded the city's streets. Historians have blamed the crack storm that engulfed D.C. on Rayful. Rayful was the president and CEO of what authorities called the largest network for coke street sales in Washington, D.C. As a teenager, he did business with Colombian cartels and ironically destroyed the same Northeast neighborhood he grew up in, but at the same time helping residents by paying rents and buying clothes and food for them. He was a contradiction in terms, a Robin Hood for the hood. Edmond has emerged as one of the most recognized people of the last 50 years in Washington, D.C. His story has been told and retold in numerous books, magazines, and DVDs. Rayful was D.C.'s gangster legend until he tarnished his reputation by snitching after getting busted again, moving more cocaine into the city from his prison cell than he did or the streets. Number 2. Peter Pistol Pete of Bronx, New York, and the Sex Money Murder Gang. Pistol Pete acquired a reputation as a ruthless assassin who made millions in the drug game in the late 80s and early 90s. He was known for busting his guns with no conscience, a modern-day Billy the Kid. Pistol Pete was quick to draw and quicker to blast someone. Pistol Pete and the blood-affiliated Sex Money Murder Gang were the scourge of the Soundview section of the Bronx back in the day. He was known as one of the most feared and powerful men in New York during the crack era and could get people destroyed on his word alone. He turned his neighborhood red in more ways than one and continued to exert his influence even after his incarceration. During his incarceration at Rikers Island in 1996, he turned blood and brought sex money murder into the fold. O.G. Mack and Deadeye McKenzie recruited Pistol Pete, and he turned his whole area onto the Bloods. He continued to run his drug empire from his prison cell using letters and the phone, but cooperators put his name in the mix, and he was indicted in North Carolina and eventually in New York City for several murders. At 20-year-old Pistol, Pete went down, and the charges kept coming. A bunch of his comrades in arms turned on him, and now he is serving multiple life sentences at ADX Florence, the BOP's Supermax, with limited communication. It was said he was about to get out of the Supermax, but the feds reconsidered when America's Most Evil Gangsters did a recent segment on Pistol Pete, and they realized the influence he still holds. Pistol Pete remains a revered figure in New York and by blood factions all over the East Coast. He is a street star and icon to this day. His name has become a part of hip-hop love in rhymes by gangster rapper Nas. Number 1. Wayne Silk Perry of Washington, D.C. Wayne Perry has been called the Michael Jordan of the homicide game, a professional head hitter and stone-cold slayer. The Washington Post called him one of the district's most heinous assassins. Wayne Perry is the most infamous gangster to ever walk the streets of Washington, D.C., aka Drama City. In the Chocolate City, things were going down by any means necessary, and Silk took this attitude to new extremes with broad daylight killings. He would literally walk right up and blow someone's head off. Murder, robbery, drug dealing, and extortion were said to be his business, and he took them all dead serious. Silk is the man who protected self-proclaimed Harlem drug Lord Alberto Alpo Martinez. Working as a bodyguard and hitman for Alpo, Perry met his downfall. Alpo repaid Silk's loyalty by snitching him out to the tune of multiple life sentences. He has gone down in infamy as one of the top soldiers from the murder capital. It was said that when Wayne was on the streets, certain hustlers wouldn't even drive nice cars because they didn't want Wayne to think they were getting money and take their shit. He put fear into the hearts of people in D.C. like no other during his run. After being buried in the BOP's Supermax prison in ADX Florence for almost 20 years.